This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
Embryos have a 30 to 60% difference in the predisposition to severe diseases. With Orchid, parents can identify their embryo at lowest genetic risk rather than just a random outcome. Our genetic calculator can show the impact of embryo selection. Discuss embryo screening and IVF with a genetics expert. Hey everybody, this is Razib Khan with the Unsupervised Learning podcast, and I'm here with my friend Louise Perry. Louise has a podcast, Maiden Mother Matriarch. I've actually been on her podcast. She also writes for various places. I think I see you in UnHerd a lot, but you're all over the place. Like, people can find you. It's not that difficult. You often write, Louise. You often write about gender ideology, and that sort of stuff. We're probably not going to talk about too much about that today. The reason I'm having you on is I want to talk to a British person or an English person, however you want to say it, however you identify, because I think some of the listeners, this has probably come through in some of my podcasts and episodes. I have been very curious about the United Kingdom, in particular, England, because, the culture is a bit more similar, I would say, to the U.S. than Scotland or Wales, and like what's been happening since basically the financial crisis 2008. And I talked to Ed West about this last year, a couple of years ago. Your culture, you guys pay attention to our politics, our entertainment, et cetera, et cetera. Also, the quickest way I can say it, and I'm not saying this to be pejorative or offensive to the listeners, is you're turning into a third world country. I know people are outsourcing to Britain because it's an English speaking country and it's very cheap. So you guys are starting to compete with the Philippines, and this is not a joke. In terms of like tech services, other things. And a lot of this you can see in the aggregate. Some things you can see in aggregate summary data that people are saying, well, it's totally different if you go there. I don't think it's totally different if you go there. I haven't actually been to Britain since 2010, but I have a lot of friends who go back and forth, a lot of British friends. Things are expensive. Their salaries are way lower than what they're offered for the same work. The houses are old. Your housing is out of control. Your immigration policy is out of control. You don't really have good ideological sorting on your parties. There's a lot of class divisions that are still there, that have been there forever, but they're exacerbated. So there's a lot of, candidly, a lot of problems in your country. And I don't know where we want to start, but let's start with that. Let's start with housing, okay? Because Americans can relate to that, and we think we have a housing problem. But the reality is we have a housing problem in a few very, very highly preferred areas of the country. But the average American actually has a pretty good deal. Believe it or not, out there, guys, I know the interest rates are a little higher. But, if you live in the Midwest, if you live in parts of Texas, the South, rural parts of New England, it's not that bad. It's just that, Bosnia Wash, California, where I'm from, parts of the urban Pacific Northwest, right? But there are large parts of the U.S. where you can have housing. Your country, you have more than 60 million people, and you're tiny. You're a tiny country. I think you're the third or fourth most dense country in the world. So I think your housing problem is a little bit more extreme. So can you talk a little bit about the housing issues and what you guys are or aren't doing about it?
So first thing to understand about Britain is that we only have one city. I know that we technically have a whole bunch of cities, but really we only have one city, which is London, because there are so many professions, and particularly middle-class professions, that are only based in London. Like, if you want to work in politics, if you want to work in media, if you want to work in law, the list goes on of all the sort of aspirational jobs that you want to do, you have to work in London. Post-COVID, it has become a little bit easier for people to work hybrid or work remotely, whatever, but pretty much you're tied to the London housing market if you want to participate in any of those jobs. The only kind of middle class jobs, and when I say middle class, I should say upper middle class. In Britain, we say middle class to mean what you would say upper middle class. We don't mean middle class to mean ordinary. We mean middle class to mean well off. The only upper middle class jobs that you can do outside of London are really medicine, a handful of other things, but you'll take a massive cut to your wages. So basically, any ambitious person in this country needs to live in London or commute into London. That's the reason really why the housing crisis is as bad as it is, because if you lived in, there are still, I think the average house price in the country now is something like £250,000. But that's not really an accurate representation of what's going on, because you can buy houses very cheaply in parts of the country that are completely, basically not economically productive at all. If you're a Substack aristocrat like you and I, Razib, you can to some extent do that, right? Because you can live wherever and just work remotely. But Substack artisan is maybe the better way of describing it. But for most people, that's not an option. So in reality, what you're looking at is you have to pay for this very scarce resource. Now, here's the wild thing about London housing, which people, I think, in other countries will simply not believe. In my borough, we live in London for now, but we will move in the coming year or so, which we can get onto where we might move to. We live in Southwark, which is a central London borough, and 40% of housing units in Southwark are social housing, meaning that they are available at heavily subsidised rates, sometimes for free if people have their housing benefit paid for them by central government. There's a complex relationship between central government and local government, but it doesn't really matter for this purposes. The point is that 40% of housing units are let by the government, and about 50% of people living in these central London like subsidised housing units are born overseas, and a higher proportion of them, and of the remaining 50%, quite a lot of them, their parents will have been born overseas. So you've got quite a lot of second generation immigrants as well. You can see this when you look at the government provide, I don't really know why they do this, but they provide information based on ethnicity, like what proportion of people of particular ethnicities live in social housing. And for some ethnicities, particularly in London, it's very, very high. Very high. So like, I think something like 90% of Somalis live in social housing in London, for instance. Very high for all African and Caribbean groups, very high for Bangladeshis who live mostly in East London. You basically have this quite crazy situation where London is increasingly populated exclusively by wealthy people who are not necessarily white British. They might also be Europeans, Americans, whatever, East Asians. Or it's occupied by people who are very poor and who are disproportionately not native British. So white working class people don't live in London anymore. They just don't. You basically will not see them. You won't hear a Cockney accent in London unless you go quite far out, because they've all moved out. And increasingly, a lot of people who are not rich but are still doing these professional jobs will live quite far out and do very long commutes. Because that's the only way they can, they just can't afford it. And because you have this artificially restricted supply because of the social housing situation, which is so crazy. And like we're approaching an election. This is well known among conservatives, particularly young conservatives in this country, because obviously the younger you are, the more likely this is to be a pressing issue, because most older generations own their own houses. Because the housing bubble really started in the really big housing boom started in the early 90s. So basically, if you bought London housing in the early 90s, you are now a millionaire, typically. And so quite a lot of boomer white British people have actually done very well from this phenomenon, because they're able to sell their expensive properties and maybe move to the country and buy something beautiful.
Or move to Mallorca.
Move to Mallorca. I mean, that's considered a little bit déclassé. More like if you're fancy, you move to like Cornwall, right? They've done quite well from this. It's the younger generation who are very aggrieved. Now, people aren't necessarily clear on like what is causing this, because in general, there are various sort of theories that are bandied around about why London housing in the southeast is so expensive. I mean, interest rates, whatever, like all that quantitative easing, all that kind of stuff, maybe that played a part. But like the supply and demand thing is so obviously, like we've got net immigration levels last year of like I think it was £600,000 a year, 600,000 people rather.
That's a lot of people.
Year before 700,000. This is a population of, well, supposedly our population is I think 68 million now. I think it's widely believed that the population is actually probably quite a lot higher than that, because that's based on census data, and people who have who are either here illegally or have kind of grey immigration status are not very likely to respond to the census. So it seems, and there's some reason to believe that there are quite a lot of people living illegally that the government just don't know about, particularly in London. So the population is almost certainly actually higher than 68 million, which is why as well our GDP per capita has actually fallen for the last 5 quarters, I want to say. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's our GDP. Yeah. Our GDP has grown by like 0.2% in the last year, but because the population has grown so much, the GDP per capita has fallen. And the thing is the other thing to know, right, is because London is like the only city we have, it also means that London is really the only region that is a net tax contributor. So if you removed London from the British economy, we would have basically a poor Eastern European economy. That would be the level that we were at. London is propping us up. Even then, our GDP per capita is increasingly looking quite bad compared with places like Poland. It wasn't that long ago that we had an influx of Polish workers who wanted to come to the UK to make money. And I was just
Polish plumbers.
Right. I was just talking to a Romanian woman the other day who's here working with her husband. The classic thing they do is they come here and they work hard before they have children. They save money. They go home. They buy a nice house in Romania. They start their family. Great. And she's saying increasingly, even Romanians don't think it's worth it because you can't actually earn that much. And the quality of life in Romania is quite good. So, we're not even able to really outcompete a lot of Eastern European countries now. And if we didn't have London, there'd be no chance, because London still has quite a lot of...
it's a world-class city.
Yeah, it still generates a lot of wealth, mostly through financial services. But we also don't manufacture anything. So if America was as densely populated as Britain, I believe you would have 4 billion people living in America.
Yeah, so I looked up the numbers. So in England, I'm going to use England because Scotland skews the United Kingdom stats because there's no one that lives there. And it's not that small. Okay?
Yeah, I have. Yeah, go on, but I have something to say about this because, yes, I'd like to say England as well.
So it's 430 people per square kilometers, which is about the same as India. And actually, the Netherlands is 530, which I think should be a kind of like baseline of a packed country, right? So you guys are approaching Netherlands on official statistics, which you say, as I've heard a lot of English people say that they think it's an underestimate for the various reasons you say. So you guys are really packed.
Right, and you can feel it. I mean, there are still some regions where we still have national parks and stuff, but certainly in the southeast, I mean, you will just drive through housing without ever really seeing fields. You can easily do that in parts of the southeast. Yeah, on the England versus Britain question, I mean, it's a bit slippery because obviously the UK is as a nation is England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. The Republic of Ireland is, of course, its own nation. In terms, of population, people overwhelmingly live in England. And England is overwhelmingly the most economically productive country of those. Northern Ireland's really poor, Wales is really poor, Scotland is mostly really poor as well, though they have some oil wealth. But I also kind of prefer to use England because I don't like the way that British has been repurposed for there's been this strong attempt to make British a term that you can easily attach a suffix to in the same way that you do so in America,
Yeah.
So we'll talk about British Caribbean, British Pakistani, whatever. No one ever talks about English Caribbean or English Pakistani because there hasn't been that effort to kind of create a national identity that can accommodate mass migration, basically, with the word English. So I will sometimes make a point of describing myself as English for that reason. But yes,
Well, okay,
anyway.
so I've heard of two different perspectives on this, two different angles.
Mhm.
There's, what you guys call BAME or whatever, like basically non-white, I think, minorities. They
Yeah.
really, a lot of them complain that English, or say, well, English is like chauvinistic, or it's just for white people. So they'll use
Yeah.
British. And then I've heard some, basically like kind of like what we in the United States would call white nationalists, but kind of like very, very far right people are like, yeah,
Mhm.
English is just for the white people. They can never be English. And so I'm just wondering, like, so my understanding is it's kind of becoming a consensus that it's an ethnonym for the white indigenous population, right? That's how it's being perceived. Are you trying to say that it should be a broader term?
I think that I think that both sides there you're describing are basically settling on the same position, which is that English is more of an ethnic identifier than it is a national identifier. I think that there's a very good reason to use it as a national identifier as well, because England is quite different from the other countries.
And the same doesn't seem to apply to, say, I don't know, like, look, hardly anyone lives in Wales, so we can just ignore that. But the same doesn't seem to apply to Scottish. So, like Scottish, Pakistani, or whatever, you know what I'm saying? Like they're okay with saying they're Scottish. So Scottish is not a bad term somehow.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point there about the fact that Welsh nationalism is a thing, Scottish nationalism is a thing, Irish nationalism is obviously a thing. English nationalism is very taboo.
Yeah, just even you saying it, I don't know much about it. Even you saying it, I was like, oh, well, I'm thinking of like, the BNP people.
Yeah, right. And it's an interesting question as to why that is. It may be because, in reality, because we're a post-imperial nation, right? And that's a very important part of British political history and our decline. And really everyone knows that it was an English empire mostly, and that it was based out of London. And, I think there's that feeling that maybe England isn't allowed to have nationalist sympathies or have a nationalist movement or identity because of that past. That seems like the most kind of. I think English people are not used to thinking of themselves as underdogs at all.
Yeah, I will say that that's fair and true, but we do need to remember that people from Scotland were actually overrepresented in the overseas because they had fewer economic opportunities, right? I mean, arguably,
they owned more slaves than the average English person. Yeah, exactly.
Well, if you do the math, which is like complicated math, and obviously there's a lot of arguments, like what parts of the empire were actually beneficial to who? So arguably, I mean, and this is still arguable, but probably most people say India was a net positive because like there's so few resources that went into it. The British just took over really the indigenous system, but like places like Africa were like massive sink, but they did benefit certain people in the United Kingdom. So they probably benefited Scottish people who didn't have opportunities in Scotland, and they benefited the lower upper class, who could resettle in South Africa or the highlands of Kenya. So actually, the stylized fact is the middle and the working classes of England subsidized the empire for, the lower upper classes and people from the periphery. You could actually think about it that way, but I think that'll like freak a lot of people out when they think about it in detail. So it's not like talking about, but this is a key thing about a lot of the European empires. They were vanity projects by the metropolitan elites that were subsidized by the middle class. And this is why, not to get off on a tangent, but this is why Bismarck just kept blocking it. Because he did the math and he's just like, Silesia is worth like 100 times more than the whole continent of Africa, And so as long as Bismarck was in power, Germany never really had an overseas empire. Once Bismarck was out of power, people who didn't do the math took over. And I mean, really, like, do you know anything about the German Empire? No, because it was like a total boondoggle and a disaster the whole way. I mean, obviously England and France, they got the good choice parts, and there's a few countries like Portugal, which because of their lack of resources, maybe it benefited them. But really, the economic logic of the empire is actually not that. This is something where like maybe the British far right and the post-colonial types will agree, where they think that the empire was something rational to do. But if you look at it, it was just about ego. A lot of it. This is not true of every single part of the empire. Obviously, the British Caribbean produced a lot of surpluses. If you read Regency era literature, like how is that subsidized? We could talk about that. But when you do all the math, ironically, the numbers don't work out in the way that I think a lot of people would expect. In particular, I think the key point is the British working class didn't get much out of it at all. And this is the majority during industrialization of the 19th century that's actually creating the wealth of England. Because the rich were always rich, the poor were always poor. The key is during industrialization, you had this like rapidly increasing working class that was shifting towards consumption. They didn't get much out of the empire at all, actually, because they were the producers, right?
With one exception. So I agree with that assessment in general. The only difference, though, that's important between the British Empire and other European empires is that we had so many settler colonies, not least America.
The white dominions.
Yeah, and Australia and New Zealand and South Africa for a period. And I think a lot of British working class people, for instance, emigrated to Australia, including my ancestors. I'm descended from people who did that, and did benefit enormously from having access to those new resources. So I think that's, and I will say as well, I think that's an important factor as well in thinking about what's going to happen in the coming decades in Britain. Sure. I think a very, very likely outcome of all of this, and a big problem that the British state is facing, is that we have so many Anglophone countries to which upper middle class British people can emigrate. I think we're going to see a massive, massive loss of human capital from Britain. Whereas the French say they can't really go anywhere. The Germans can't really go anywhere.
They're not going to go to Quebec.
Unless they get visas to America and they're willing to work in English. There just isn't this, whereas at the moment, at least, it's very easy for British people to emigrate to Australia. The only reason that people aren't doing so generally is because of just that it's so far away and it's difficult and whatever. But I think that people will start doing so in very large numbers soon.
Well, so just in our previous conversation, I will, just for the listener, I'm going to say James Bellish's Replenishing the World is a very good book. It's about just like, just the demographic increase in England and how people went to Australia, the United States, and stuff like that. And, obviously, some of the migration probably released overpopulation pressure. And so there was some synergy, as you said, to the white dominions. Although, those were kind of almost like overseas extensions of Britain in a lot of ways. Unlike, say, Africa or Asian colonies, right?
Yeah. Australia is a completely Anglo-Celtic country. So is New Zealand. Aside from, now there's quite a lot of immigration to Australia from East Asia and so on, but it's still fairly minor. They compared with America, it remains a much more distinctively British kind of culture.
Well, I don't want to get into I want to go back to the housing issue. Okay. Yeah. So, there's a lot of stuff on social media that talks about Tokyo, and how housing is relatively cheap in Tokyo. I live in Austin, and basically what happened is during the pandemic, there was a lot of building because a lot of people were moving here from the West Coast and the Northeast, and rents have actually declined over the last 3 years, which is apparently it's against the laws of real estate. If you talk to people from the West Coast or the Northeast, they don't understand it. We just built more housing. So what happens is, we have like these condos in these big skyscrapers, and rich people live in them. And so they don't buy 3 or 4 bedroom houses because why would they? Whereas if you go to Silicon Valley, the type of housing that people live in that are very well off is not very nice housing because they don't allow development to happen, because some of the dynamics that you're talking about in England, where you have incumbents who don't allow, who are incentivized not to build, that is the key issue there. So in England, is this a very similar issue? Because I don't know about your zoning and all this stuff. Like, what is going on? Why are you guys not building? Because if you're this dense, you should be building really, really, basically it's diversified housing is what you need. You need it some regular homes for people that have big families. But if you're a very, very well-off upper middle class professional who's single or dual income, no kids, you should be living in a very, very luxurious high rise so that you don't have to live in a regular house. I'll put it that way. So tell me what's going on.
Yeah, we don't build enough. Partly that's because our net immigration levels are so high that keeping up with them would be really challenging. So I think that we build, actually, if you look at the number of houses built per year, it's not like it's actually gone down. It's not as high as one would want, but it's not like it's actually gone down. It's been fairly flat for quite a long time. The problem is just that net immigration levels are so high. And also that immigration is so strongly concentrated in the southeast that you just can't really keep up. I'm not a housing expert. Someone like Ben Southwood or Sam Bellman or Samuel Hughes. They're all housing experts. Very good to read on this if you want the fine grained stuff on British housing. My understanding is that we actually do not have enough labourers to keep up with the amount of housing that would have to be built per year to keep up with the net immigration demand. We don't like make enough bricks. There is like serious practical impediments to actually being able to do that. There are also significant issues with planning and with NIMBYism. Again, there's a important generational divide there, where older Britons are much more likely to own their own houses and to object strongly to building near them, partly because of aesthetic concerns, partly because it doesn't matter to them, and it might drive down their own house prices, arguably, if like supply was increased that much. Also, I think because one of the stipulations in a lot of new developments is that it has to contain a certain amount of social housing. We have a really high proportion of social housing compared with a lot of other countries. Compared, for instance, with Australia, is much higher. In Britain, I believe it's much higher than in America, although it's going to vary state to state. One of the things that I think is going on actually when a lot of homeowners object to new housing developments near them is they actually don't want to have social housing tenants near them. And the only way of blocking that from happening is blocking the housing full stop. And so people will be very, very agitated about doing that. And a lot of politicians are just outrageous about this, because they'll simultaneously say, oh, we need more housing for our young families, yada, yada. But then they'll also back their local NIMBY campaign because it's in their interests too. And because of having a disproportionate number of older voters, just as in America, older people are more likely to vote. There are lots of them. They have a disproportionate power at the polls. And so it's just mass building is just not politically popular. Combined with, yes, net migration levels being so high that even if we had much more building, it still wouldn't actually keep pace with what's needed. So,
I'm gonna bring some statistics. You talk about social housing, like again, like to Americans, like this stuff is frankly pretty alien. So first of all, public housing. Yep. Very few people in the U.S. live. Public housing is just scary. If you live in public housing, like you're super poor or marginalized, whatever. You know what I'm saying? Public housing, like that's like it brings connotations of gang warfare, all sorts of crazy things. Nobody would want to live in that. Less than 1% of Americans live in public. I don't personally know anyone who has lived in public housing, like in my whole life. I just don't know those people. Okay. Yeah. Section 8, which is subsidies, vouchers, 2.7% of Americans. Okay. So housing in the U.S., like whatever its problems, it is pretty much a free market thing. Whereas it looks like in the U.S. or the U.K. or in England, almost 20% live in social housing. So we're talking about more than an order of magnitude. So because you guys keep talking about this, honestly, I have no intuitive understanding of. I mean, I watched some British TV series before, and people live in social housing, and they seem kind of lower or working class. Working class people in the U.S. do not live, or at least there are some people who, for cultural reasons, are okay with living in that sort of housing. Mm-hmm. But in general, it's extremely poor, marginalized people. Think ghetto, quote unquote, like that sort of thing. Yeah. And our public housing projects were destroyed actually in the last generation, and people were redistributed among Section 8 because the concentration of poverty and violence was so great that it was basically like a human rights, issue with like putting people into those projects. So we don't have that sort of thing, and it's very interesting that you guys are packing immigrants into social housing, is what I'm hearing, which is like, okay, if you come to the U.S. and you're an immigrant, positive or negative, you got to work. Yeah. And I've actually heard this. My dad, I remember like telling one of my cousins who was thinking about whether he was going to go to Europe or the U.S. for schooling, for higher ed, and like obviously that was going to set the trajectory of where that person was going to live the rest of their life. And I remember my dad specifically saying, like, okay, if you come to the United States, you don't eat if you don't work. He wanted to be very specific about that because there was like, oh, America's so rich, but that doesn't mean that you gotta like that it's rich because you sit on your butt. Like you got to work, and they expect everyone here to work. I mean, we do have various social benefits that have increased a lot over the last like 10 to 20 years, I feel, but still, it's not the situation that I'm hearing about. I mean, like I've been to Europe this 90% of Somalis in social housing, this is a recurrent thing. It's a very underdeveloped country. They don't come with large human capital endowments, so they are on welfare forever. Well, in the US, they're not doing that great, but they are known to start businesses because that's what you have to do. Like the welfare just isn't, our welfare benefits or our public benefits are just not good enough to support a family of 7 or 8 like they have.
Yeah, it's wild. I mean, and it's more true in London. So you say 20% social housing, that sounds about right. It's higher in London. It's more like 30, 40%.
Yeah, that's what I've heard.
I think historically that's because of the Blitz. It's because a lot of housing was destroyed during the Second World War by bombing, and it was and what was rebuilt in its place was because that was during a period of it's also during the period of the NHS's founding. So it was a very socialist period of British political history, basically. And so you ended up with a lot of housing built that was for the purposes of social housing. Now, the original intention behind this was to provide housing to the respectable working classes. And there used to be expectations placed on people that you had to be law-abiding, have a good local reputation, whatever. You had to jump a certain threshold in order to get access to the subsidised housing. And the reasoning behind it was partly because you wanted to get people out of slums, Victorian London, obviously, full of horrible housing and terrible health problems or whatever. And also, I think that part of the intention was to keep communities together. So you say, the East End Cockneys or whatever all living in social housing. So it doesn't necessarily mean horrible housing. And sometimes social housing can actually be quite surprisingly nice. I mean, you'll occasionally read stories because some housing is set aside for the purposes of being social housing and was built with that intention, although never really built. It's not like in, say, Paris with the banlieue or Section 8 housing in America where you have these big ghettos. That's never been how it is in Britain. You always have it interspersed. You'll have social housing units on the same road as some of the most expensive housing in the country. Okay, and sometimes as well, the council will pay people's rent to live in a private rental that isn't designated as social housing. And so people will end up in surprisingly nice houses. And this will pop up in the tabloids every now and again, refugee family living in £3 million Georgian house in Clerkenwell kind of story. That does happen. Britain is just a more socialist country than America.
Yeah, many such cases.
Yeah. Ditto with healthcare.
I want to say real quickly, social housing, I think it's weird, but I know there are places like Singapore and Israel where most of the housing is owned by the government. So it can be, if it's most of the housing stock, it's just a normal thing. And it's just normal housing. In the US, it's one extreme. As I said, I don't think I know anybody in my life, and I know a lot of people, I have to say. I don't think I know anybody in my life who has lived in a public housing unit. I probably have known people, although they don't talk about it, who grew up with Section 8 at some point. Not for their whole childhood. People go through things, whatever. We've all been through it. A lot of us have. But it's a very, very weird thing in the US. I feel like Britain is kind of in between, where you guys have a substantial minority that are in social housing, and it's a particular type of person, but it's not so marginalized that it's outside of because you guys talk about it all the time. I've heard British people talk about it all the time. In the US, we don't talk about public housing because it's just not a major thing anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I know plenty of people who grew up in social housing. It's not that uncommon. And it's not necessarily horrible housing, as I say. The thing that was the two errors that have led, policy errors that have led to our current situation in London is one, that it used to be that social housing was allocated to respectable working class people, right? And there was a deliberate effort to make sure that people weren't committing crime, yada. That changed, I think, in the 1970s. I can't remember the exact piece of legislation, but now it's kind of the opposite in that social housing is given based on vulnerability. So you're more likely to get social housing if you're, released from prison. You're more likely to get social housing if you're a single mother. You're more likely to get social housing if you're unemployed. Basically, all kinds of social dysfunction are more likely to see you get social housing. That combined with mass immigration from poor parts of the world where people are often coming and are just basically not able to stand on their own 2 feet economically in this country has led to this bizarre situation where you have somewhere like Tower Hamlets, which is a central east area of London, which is literally within sight of Canary Wharf. So Canary Wharf is like the new the financial services used to be based in the City of London, right in the centre. But when the internet came along, basically those buildings were no longer fit for purpose because they couldn't accommodate the massive cables and so on that were necessary in order to keep the computers running. And so Canary Wharf was built in the 1980s, 1990s to be the new financial centre, which it remains. And Canary Wharf is very glitzy. You know, you walk around it and it feels like being in any kind of CBD in a rich city. Canary Wharf is within sight of Tower Hamlets. It's very, very close. But Tower Hamlets is like overwhelmingly occupied by specifically Bengali migrants. And this is also a slightly mysterious thing. Like, how is it that you end up, social housing is supposed to be allocated based on need and like relatively fairly and by lottery. And yet what ends up happening is that you do end up with these ethnic enclaves where probably what is going on there is some degree of corruption, which isn't really obvious to the British state, but is going on nonetheless.
So one of the weird things that I have to say about, well, this is common with migration patterns worldwide, but you know how it happens. Mm-hmm. So you said Bengali, but you know they don't speak Bengali. They speak a dialect that's not intelligible with standard Bengali. Because I bet when I was about 14 years ago, I went to Europe. The Bangladeshis in Italy, they're a fair number in Italy. They're from all over the country, and I can understand when I'm walking past them. I can understand what they're saying. When I was in London, I would walk past them, and it was it's like an English speaker listening to Dutch. So their dialect is very specific. So they don't even speak. So they're all from Sylhet. They're from one part of Bangladesh. They're actually not from, like, I have some relatives in England, and you know, it's fine. Like, they get along with them, but they're on the outside. Like, if you're not from Sylhet, if you're not Sylheti, you're on the outside. So it's like kind of weird. You have the same issue with the Pakistanis. They're not actually from all parts of Pakistan. 90% of them are from Mirpur, which is like a northern area on the border with Kashmir. And so there's some sort of chain migration going on here. So not only do you guys have these ethno-linguistic ghettos, or like they're like ghettos within ghettos. They're very, very they're very, very tight. It's like, it would be like if everybody in the US is from Essex. Yeah. Who's English, you know? Which is not true at all. They come from all different parts of England and stuff like that. Which makes a difference in terms of just like integration. Like, I can tell you my relatives, they don't live in Bengali areas, partly just because they're not really Bengali like that. Like, on paper they're Bengali, but when you're talking about Bengali in England, it's basically Sylheti. And they have like somewhat different ways. And also when they speak to each other, they speak in a different dialect. They speak in dialect, you know? Anyway, I just think it's like really strange how that worked out. And that's a big difference between immigration in the US compared to like some European countries I've seen, where there's like huge blocks that are very coherent that come over from another country. And obviously we have some of that with Mexican Americans. But I have to say, like, if you're looking at the intermarriage rates are like 30% between Hispanics and non-Hispanic, you know, like basically 30% of Hispanics marry non-Hispanic whites. So we have a totally different situation. We have one Muslim ghetto in the United States that's close to a ghetto, and that would be Hamtramck in Michigan, which is a suburb of, it's close to Detroit, but that ghetto is like divided between Yemenis, Bangladeshis, and some other groups. So it's still not like the UK or some European countries where it's like you go to a Moroccan area, you know? So it's like having like the lack of, you know, in the United States, we have enough diversity and dispersion. Maybe it's just because of our space, but also we don't have the same colonial history, you know?
Yeah, some of it is the colonial history. I think some of it initially was the colonial history, in that there was a period. So mass migration in the UK starts in the 1960s. In 1950s, and this is something that Brits need to remember, because because we're also Yankee brained and we watch so much American TV. There's a tendency for Brits to assume that our history is like that of America, and it isn't. So Britain was an extremely ethnically homogenous place in the 1950s, right? Unlike America, which of course is a settler colonial nation composed of lots of different ethnicities. It's only in the 1960s that you start seeing large numbers of people coming initially from the Caribbean, and to some extent from India and Pakistan. You also have, there's also an interesting group, often referred to as Ugandan Asians, but basically people who had been working, who come from India and were working in Uganda and Kenya, and then were driven out by Idi Amin and other decolonization violence and came to the UK. They have tended to be a very, very successful group. So Rishi Sunak is descended from those migrants, as is Priti Patel, as is Suella Braverman. These are all very senior British politicians, very successful group of people, lots of doctors and accountants and stuff. So some of it is to do with these colonial patterns, but it's also, I think, just that we've never had, there's always been this promise, which has never been delivered upon, that we would have a so-called Australian points-based system, right? So basically a meritocratic immigration system that's always been promised and it's never been delivered upon, except maybe in like a very small number of areas. But like if you compare British migration, say, with Australian, which ditto was basically an Anglo-Celtic country up until the 1950s, you have, in Australia, you have quite a lot of Chinese and Filipino migrants who are disproportionately successful and working in, again, these middle-class professions, or Filipinos, lots of them working in healthcare. And then aside from that, you really just, and increasingly you have also high-skilled Indian migrants to Australia. And then you have little smatterings of groups, like refugee groups, like there was some refugees who came from Lebanon because of the Civil War and things like that, who were settled in New South Wales. But you don't have these big, like, in the Midlands, you just have very, very large numbers of Mirpuris. You just don't have that in Australia or in America. And I think it's because we've permitted a lot of chain migration. And also to some extent because immigration policy has permitted the importation of cheap labour. So the reason that you ended up with lots of Mirpuris in the Midlands was because of the textile industry. And that's where it was based. That's now like largely collapsed. So you also have a lot of unemployment. But Britain cottoned on quite early to the idea of businesses benefiting from these, from bringing in cheap labourers from overseas. So this is why it's historically been, resistance to this has historically come from the white working classes. The white middle classes have actually been generally very positive about mass immigration. I'd say up until about now. I think it's moving now. But they've been positive about it because they also like having cheap labour. You know, having someone to cheaply make your coffee or look after your children or any of this stuff, it's like suits the middle classes fine because they haven't really been undercutting, because we just haven't had very much skilled migration, basically, with a few exceptions.
I mean, the US, Canada, the US is the same, but we also have, I mean, the issue is that, you guys have finance, like going back to the economics of what's going on in the UK, and I've talked to like left wing, the complaints are left. This is like pan-ideological. There's something wrong with the way your economy is set up, where it's like the productivity gains aren't there. Like some of this dates back 130 years when German manufacturing started to surpass British manufacturing. But right now it's like a major issue. I looked up the statistics while you were talking about like salaries and stuff just to double check. It looks to me that the average British doctor makes about 75% less when you do the conversions and stuff. At the high end than the American doctor.
Oh, what? So it's making only 25% of what an American doctor would make.
Yeah. At the low end, it's crazy. It's crazy. I have a hard time believing some of these numbers. And considering your cost of living and stuff like that. I know people who are professionals. I know a fair number of, even in Austin's not like New York or San Francisco, but there are people from France, people from the UK, England that come here. And, many of them are actually, I like them because they're pretty libertarian. They're pretty anti-socialist. But maybe they're not the people that should be leaving. You know what I'm saying? They're very, very entrepreneurial. They want to start a business. Like I talked to a French guy who's like, for some reason he hates Tex-Mex. He loves French food. But, he said he just could not start a business. He could not get a business off the ground in France because Macron's tried to change things supposedly, but this guy says the regulations and the hiring people is just a total. He started hiring people in the U.S. He started hiring people in Asia, and then he realized why do I live in France? So he moved to Austin, and he has like a distributed workforce. Great American. He loves, and also they're very patriotic. I mean, because they're not just like standard economic migrants. They're not like fleeing desperation. They're fleeing from some level of comfort, but real frustration with all of the ties that bind them from kind of unleashing their creativity, unleashing their productivity. So you guys as in like England has a finance sector that's very strong. But that seems to be, I know a little bit about genetics and life sciences, and England has traditionally been pretty strong there. And I know actually the British government, I have friends who've worked with the British government versus the American government. The American government, it's not on their radar at all. They just like leave it to the free market. The British government is actually very enthusiastic about it and knows, there's a reason that the structure of DNA was discovered in the UK. One of them was an American, obviously, but still, the UK is the center of a lot of life sciences innovation. The problem, and Oxbridge has a lot of stuff going on. The problem, though, is you can lean on that history only so long. Like the salaries are just so low outside of finance. The salaries are all like, let's say on the order of a half. That's like a good starting point. That's what I've seen with engineers. English engineers are getting like half of the similar. I mean, this is being optimistic. Getting half of what an American engineer would make. Like, how are you going to keep your talent? You guys speak English. You're culturally pretty assimilable to the U.S. actually. So how are you going to keep your talent? I don't understand what's going to happen. So as we're talking, the election has not happened. Okay, but I'm going to post this after the election, and the Conservative Party wipe out, Labor, whatever. This is not actually a radical change. My understanding, Labor is like generic leftism. Keir Starmer's kind of trying to tone down some of the wackiness of the Corbyn era and maybe not sound as woke. But basically, it's going to be same old. There's no radical transformation here. What is up with your Conservative Party? What is up with the Tories? Like, they were kind of, put in power to execute Brexit. Which, is kind of like a way to emphasize, the UK's independence. But also, it seems like there was a lot of concerns about immigration that were channeled into Brexit. But you guys have like massive immigration, even after the Tories are in power. I mean, what is going on here? It doesn't make any sense. Like, is your political class just candidly totally unrepresentative and rotten?
Yeah. And I mean, on your earlier question about what are we going to do, how we're not going to lose our talent, I think we are. So to lay out the what's going on with the election, and bearing in mind that this, I'm speaking after it's happened, but what's currently projected to happen currently is, the Tories are going to do incredibly badly. They had a large majority in 2019. When Boris Johnson was Prime Minister. Boris Johnson is personally very popular. He has a kind of populist right energy, except what he actually did in office is that he didn't fulfill any of his promises. There was no Australian style points-based system. We did leave the European Union, but what happened was that we stopped having lots of immigrants from Poland and Romania who, yes, were undercutting working class wages in some sectors, but in general were quite good immigrants. Like, they're quite law abiding, they're Christian, they're Europeans. Like, it wasn't like that disruptive. That immigration has basically ended post Brexit, and it's been replaced by much larger flows of people from mostly India, Pakistan, Nigeria, and often working in low pay sectors like social care. And so people are very angry about that. I mean, the line that's quite often used is that the government took Brexit literally but not seriously, in that they did leave the European Union, but they didn't interpret the vote as just being an anti-mass immigration vote, which is why so many people voted for Brexit. They were trying to signal their dislike of mass immigration, and that's not how it was received by the government. Why exactly the government has done this is a matter for just it will be a matter, I suppose, for historians to discuss. Like, partly it's ideological. Like, there are just a lot of, like, the Conservative Party it's not comparable to the Republican Party. It's much to the left of the Republican Party. All politics is much to the left of American politics. Like, no party would ever countenance, like, damaging the NHS in any way. Every party promises more socialised healthcare, like every party promises to protect state pensions. State pensions are currently something like 15% of state spending. So we give every single person, the age at which you get it varies slightly depending on where you were born, but we give every single person, regardless of how rich they are, quite a generous state pension alongside all the free healthcare and everything. So basically we're just funneling so much money towards the elderly in order to get their votes. And there's all the stuff with like the fact that the old people own homes and young people don't and whatever. Why are government doing this? Yeah, I don't know. It is really insane. To me, it does feel like suicidal behaviour on the part of government. And this is partly why reform has become a strong political contender. And at the time of speaking, reform has just nudged ahead of the Conservatives in terms of vote share, just raw vote share. So Labour are projected to win resoundingly, but if it were if it were a proportional system, reform would be the opposition party. It isn't a proportional system though. It's a first past the post system, which means that reform will be lucky to win 5 seats. Right, reform are likely to have basically no parliamentary presence, despite being very popular. The first past the post system has always historically basically produced stability because it's very difficult for small parties to have any success whatsoever, which some people would say is a good thing. I think that at the present moment, though, the way that it's worked out is that you basically just have a uni party. The Conservatives and Labour are not very different from one another at all. Yeah. There are some things that Labour are going to do which are quite... which I dislike, like personally dislike, like they're going to, for instance, introduce a tax on private schooling. So about 8% of the population, 8% of children go to private schools. To some extent in places like London, where you have this extreme disparity between, you basically have rich people and you have very poor people living alongside each other, nothing in between. I mean, so like where we live, right, for instance, you have local schools where, like one of the coaches at my gym was telling me recently that her daughter was evacuated from the school because a child brought a gun into school. It's not as bad as it is in the States with gun crime, obviously, but we do still have a lot of gang crime in London. So basically, those are the kind of state school options that you have, state-funded school options, or you send them to private school, and which basically every upper middle class person around here does. But Labour are about to introduce a tax to make that more expensive. Labour also have various plans around having I think they're calling it the Race Equality Act. So basically that they want the things like exact racial representation in government procurement. They want to see fewer disparities in the criminal justice system, which are exactly the same disparities that you see in the US. They have various kind of... Labour are going to be worse than the Conservatives from a right-wing perspective in various ways, but also right-wing fury against the Conservatives is unmatched at the moment, and that's why they're going to be so punished at the polls, because people are just really furious, mostly about immigration, but also about just the obvious kind of third worldification of the country. The NHS is in very, very poor condition, very poor condition. And the thing is that because there isn't... people are increasingly getting private medical insurance. It's becoming a growing market, but it's still quite a marginal thing to do. And there's still a lot of private medical care, which basically isn't available. So for instance, I'm in my third trimester with our second baby. You cannot give birth in a private hospital outside of London. There are only about 5 hospitals in London which are private, and no medical insurer will cover them. So if you want to give birth privately, you have to pay out of pocket about 15 grand. And bearing in mind how much lower our salaries are than American salaries, right?
Yeah.
And if you don't live in London, you have no access to any of these hospitals anyway. And currently about 50% of NHS units, maternity units, are rated as inadequate and as unsafe. Our maternity care is like very, very bad by world standard compared with other OECD countries. It's very, very bad. And there just isn't really availability of any alternative. I think that with time that will probably change. But to be honest, I just think that people are going to leave. I would say that about 50% of our friends are thinking of emigrating, either to America or Australia, or I know one family who are thinking of going to New Zealand. And at the moment, most of those people aren't thinking about it very seriously, but I think they could. And the people who are being really squeezed are basically the people with high human capital, because they can't afford to live in London. Healthcare is extremely bad. Private education is going to become ever more expensive. Like, I mean, so speaking about us, our family, just for a sec, we're in the top 2%. We're somewhere between the top 2%, top 1% of earners in the country. Like, we're a high income family, but what we can afford, basically the choice we face is we either buy a very small house in London, because that's all we can afford, or we move out and therefore have to forego a lot of, this is more for my husband, has to forego job opportunities, has to earn less because he just can't do his job in anywhere other part of the UK, or we go overseas. Those are the options. And those are the options facing most people, really, who are in our kind of income bracket. And it just seems to me like there's no way this ends well.
Well, I mean, I think part of this is what you were talking about in terms of generational. I know people in your situation, professionals, high income, et cetera, but housing is just in desirable areas that will optimize their career and professional advancement is crazy. Most of my friends that are buying in those areas, so thinking of like my best friend from grad school just closed on a house in San Francisco. He and his wife, they're dual income, no kids. They're both in their mid-30s. They want to have kids, but they'll probably have one kid, partly for financial reasons. They both work in biotech, and I'm not going to say what their salary is, but they're definitely in the top. They're the top 1%. Their combined income, their household income. But like basically, they can they will tell you they can afford one child. And they just bought a house in San Francisco, so that's what it is, right? It's very as you say, it's very dysgenic. These are people with PhDs.
That's not the word I used, Razib. That's the word you used.
I use the word, but you don't have any control of that. But it's basically the squeeze is on, in particular the upper middle class. Just because, well, whatever. And a lot of the things that are happening in the U.S., it seems like they're exaggerated in the UK, so maybe we can learn some lessons from this. I do have to say, one of the things that's always strange to me is the British obsession with it seems like our racial issues have migrated across to you guys, because I just double checked the numbers again, because I remember when I went to London in 2010, it's very like New York City, but it's way whiter, which I know from like a British perspective, it's a mostly non-white city, but compared to American cities, it's still very white. So the UK is still, like, you guys are like 76%. You're still about 3/4 of the country is still, of England, is white British, right? In the US, that would be a very white state. It would be a very white city. It would be very, you know what I'm saying? But like, you guys perceive it as like, oh, well, there's all this diversity. But the reality is there's not, honestly, it's like concentrated in a lot of localities, but most of the country is still the way it was. You don't really have to like go full Ibram X Kendi. Like, it doesn't make any sense. But you guys decide to do it because, I don't know, I guess you're consuming our media, and like some of the stuff that I'm hearing is like porting, like, I don't know, some of the stuff is kind of like American racial hangups are ported over into England in totally like out of contextual, nonsensical ways. And I have friends who are in British academia, and I guess like some of the administrators decide to take American training and modify a bit, but it still seems very strange. Apparently, like it's like assuming like the history of slavery in the country and Black Americans. So like it's like you have to create a history of Black British people that doesn't exist. Because that's necessary for the training. So because it's just, they don't want to modify it too much because that's work.
Yeah. So some of it is to do with being Yankee-brained, and just people think that American stuff is high status, so there's this effort to recreate it. So we, for instance, have this crazy. There's this enormous emphasis put in like BBC and school curriculums and lots of sort of mainstream leftist output on the Windrush, which is, you may have heard of this. This was the boat that brought over the kind of first wave of Caribbean settlers to Britain it wasn't very many people. The narrative that has been constructed around it, and actually Ed West wrote a very good piece for The Spectator about this last year or the year before. The narrative that's been created around it is completely false. So the narrative, and there's even a poem up in Waterloo Station, which is a big train station in London, called the "You Asked, We Came," and the idea is that people were invited from the Caribbean to Britain to help reconstruct the country after the war, and therefore that people of Caribbean origin have this like essential role in the founding myth of modern Britain. This narrative is false. People were not invited over. There was actually quite a lot of agitation in Parliament about this. They didn't want people coming. They came spontaneously. Mostly people came to do quite low paid jobs and not in construction. So the idea that they're literally building post-war London is not true. So some of the reason why this has come up is because London demographics are so different from the rest of the UK. So you're right that the country as a whole is like 75% white British or something. In London, it's a third white British. So London is completely different. And because so much of culture, media, everything is based in London, the people who are the kind of cultural tastemakers get a false impression of what the country looks like. And then they're surprised when they go to other parts of the country, if they do at all, to discover that it's actually still fairly white. I think though, and also let's be clear, a lot of these parts of the white parts of the UK are often very depressed, not very economically productive, they're aging, there's a lot of obesity. Like, it's not like these other parts of the country are doing well either. I honestly think, sort of taking the long view, because you talked about 100 years or more of Britain ending up in this position, I honestly think that in a way, us having had so many settler colonies has ended up being our undoing. I think that a big part of the reason why Britain is not doing as well as America and Australia is because we have been hemorrhaging our human capital for hundreds of years, in that the most entrepreneurial and adventurous and intelligent, etc., people have been leaving. We have always had net emigration to America and Australia, always, since the founding of those countries. And what we're doing at the moment is even faster. That, yes, we're losing. I mean, like the number of doctors, for instance, that we lose every year to Australia is just extraordinary. British trained doctors going to Australia because they want to earn more money and have a better quality of life. It's just so self-destructive. And I think that in some senses that's been the pattern for much longer. It's just that we're now starting to kind of really see it playing out in terms of third worldification.
Well, I mean, okay, so I think like that's a whole different thing, obviously. But like, do you think like recently it's really been, because like it seems like upper middle class people are the ones that at least coming to America. I don't know Australia, but like the British people that I know, maybe it's because of who I know, they definitely are professional class. Like, it's like if you're not in finance, you just like you try to get out. That's what I've seen.
Yeah. I think that's the pattern. If you're sort of sufficiently adventurous to do that, which some people aren't. So some people will choose to stay because it's kind of the safer option, or because they prioritize being near family and so on, which is all fair.
Yeah, the family thing is the one thing that has held people, but I mean, at some point, people are going to be. You can't live sustainably on the wages that I'm seeing. I mean, you're having immigration from all these other countries come in, but like, are they actually even working in the service jobs? A lot of them, because with the welfare benefits, they seem pretty available to them. But that to me is like a shocking thing. How much are in social housing and all these things,
Yeah, it's quite possible to come over and basically live off the state, depending on your circumstances. But yeah, and it will vary based on ethnic group. But yes, like degree of welfare dependency. Like, we just cannot sustain the situation where we have both a generous welfare state and mass immigration. It's insane. Or mass immigration from poor parts of the world. It would be one thing.
At the magnitude that you have is, if you're talking about a net of 600,000 in a nation of 60 million, that's crazy.
Yeah. I mean, there are other countries which have very high levels of mass immigration too, but I think it's our particular combination of that, plus the social housing situation, plus socialized medicine. We also have a very high number of people out of work in this country. We have I think 5 million people on on out of work benefits, very high proportion of people who are not working because they're diagnosed with depression and anxiety. That's kind of a post-COVID thing. So simultaneously, we've got apparently enormous numbers of working age adults who can't work because they're so depressed. And then we've also got these very high levels of net migration. It just seems, I think that the government are just being really, really short-termist about it. And what they care about is boosting GDP right here, right now. But it's all kind of an illusion because GDP per capita is actually falling. And I think it's fairly obvious to people that quality of life is falling as well. And there's a lot of intergenerational tension over that. Even, going back to these kind of, I know I keep going on about the London upper middle classes, but I think they're important because these are the people basically that the state depends on for tax revenue. Like, we are so enormously dependent on the top 1% of income taxpayers, enormously, to keep all this stuff on the road because we have very, very heavy expenditure because of having socialised medicine and so on. Those people are very dissatisfied. Even people who are earning a lot are not necessarily living in houses that are as nice as their parents lived in. There's a strong sense of downward mobility. Yes, I think that those people are exactly the sort of people that we really don't want to be losing. And I do worry about, in some sense, I don't want to summon it into existence, but I do worry about a snowballing effect where people start emigrating and then people follow them because it becomes easier to emigrate when your friends are doing this.
Yeah, because your family's already there. You already have a network.
Yeah. I mean, family is an issue. I mean, it's just speaking to friends who are thinking, and this kind of applies to us. I mean, I'm an Australian citizen and a New Zealand citizen, and most of my extended family live in Australia. So it's easier for us. But friends of mine who are thinking about leaving, particularly if they're in professions like medicine, the thing that holds them back is not being able to bring their elderly parents, because at the moment you can't really bring your elderly parents with you if you emigrate to Australia. But if the Australians change that, then I think you'd see a lot more movement.
Well, okay, so I have a proposal, and I proposed this to other British people before, so I want to say, or English, whatever you want to say. This is just an idea I've recently had. Just looking at the salaries, and you guys speak English, and you have a history of gardening and other things like that. What if England becomes an American protectorate? So we take care of your foreign policy. You guys do whatever we say anyway, so it doesn't really matter. That would be very no functional change. You can keep your NHS. You don't get to vote in the US, but you can come work here. I think that would be great because I've recently, I don't know if I should say this, but I've recently switched from Spanish speaking to English speaking house cleaners, and I can tell you that's very convenient. And so I'm just imagining, and also English, you guys are very good at gardening and all these other things. And, you guys have seen the salaries at Buc-ee's. I think a lot of American service establishments would love hiring people with British accents, as long as they're not super Cockney. I think this is a win-win. And, maybe we could buy summer homes in England. I just think I think this is it's a good possibility because a lot of you guys want to come here anyways. And maybe you don't want to live here forever. Maybe you want to go retire in England. Maybe it could be a bedroom country or something like that. Because right now I don't see where there's an exit that's positive. Maybe and we can stop your immigration. You guys don't need that, whatever. Just come work in the US. Your guest workers. Culturally, there's not that much difference. I think it would be great. Probably the status of British people would drop a little bit because right now you hear a British accent, you think this is a really smart. We would see a different type of British person come over. Whatever, though. I don't know. What do you guys? I know this sounds crazy. It does sound crazy, but stuff like this starts with crazy ideas. Okay. Yes, I know we used to be a colony of this kind of but you know what? We've had a larger economy for 150 years. We've been the world superpower, and on foreign policy, you literally do almost everything we say. There would be there'd be no functional change. You could keep your crappy NHS. I don't really care what you guys do over there. What I really want is a lot of we need workers in this country. Our economy. We actually have a very low unemployment. We do need workers in this country. And Mexico's fertility rate is now below It's below 2. We're having some issues. So quote unquote, I don't know who I mean by we, but I definitely mean me. But in any case, I just think this is a great idea. And what do you think of it? Like, is it like, too much British pride? I don't know.
I personally think that we should just be annexed by you guys.
Listen, okay, I'm gonna be honest though. I don't want like a bunch of blue, because that's why I'm saying like no voting rights, because
okay.
your socialism is you gotta bring that along. Like that's like
okay, so you're not annexing us, you're colonizing us.
No, I'm just saying a protectorate. So basically, it's a beneficial relationship. You don't have to worry about. First of all, you wouldn't have to. I mean, you wouldn't have to worry about like. Okay, it's a ridiculous pretense that you guys have like the military you have. Okay, I mean, you're a little bit like Pakistan. Pakistan should really just chill out. They're never gonna really have parity with India. They're wasting money on their military. It's like socially corrosive. Blah blah blah. Like Bangladesh went the right direction. Bangladesh is basically like, don't invade us, but aside from that, we're not going to get involved in geopolitics. We're just going to focus on the economy. You guys should just not get involved in geopolitics. Stop pretending you're an imperial power. You're not. You're not. Keep your nukes so that like you can like not get blackmailed or whatever. That's about it. And then have like a home guard, and then just focus on getting your economy righted. And we need labor. You guys have labor. Yeah, you're gonna have to work hard, but like you guys have past history where you did work hard. That's where we learned it from. So I think it's good. You're culturally, like, you speak English, etc., etc. You're mostly cultural Christians, but again, like I think a lot of Americans would not want you guys to like vote, because we don't. You know what I'm saying? Like it's basically like admitting a bunch of blue states, and that's gonna cause instability, right?
Yeah.
But I think like basically like being guest worker. I mean, that's what I mean. You want like money, and like a lot of British people, English people actually do like a lot of things in England. Like they come to the States, and like we have a different cultural way of being, and it takes some adjustment. Yeah, some people like adjust to it, but the reality is, it's still not home. It's never going to be home for a lot of the British people that come here. It'll be home for their children. That's a different issue. It's just the immigrant experience, So I think it's a good compromise. I've been telling people about it recently, and people look at me like I'm crazy, but it does make sense. Like, it makes a lot more sense than, I don't know, if we took like Guatemala or something. Like, that would work? You know what I'm saying? It's just like, we don't have the history, the languages. It's just, okay, that's crazy. England though, okay, like, it's a big country with a lot of labor. You guys are having some serious governance issues that you cannot fix, partly because the first past the post system is probably the problem. These are, just to be clear, it's just like, people are elected like in the US and Canada with like these, single individual districts. It's not proportional representation, but it's made it so that you haven't had any radical parties, which is what Reform and other parties are trying to do, to try to shift the Overton window in some way. So on the continent, and for example, in Denmark, they basically have turned away from mass immigration, the whole political spectrum. And it's because of a far right-wing party that just dragged everybody. And now the Labour Party, or the Socialist Party in Denmark, Social Democrats, are basically like, we cannot have our welfare system with mass immigration. So they shut it down. Some of the stuff they're doing is like pretty harsh, actually. But whatever, it is what it is. It's much more conservative and right-wing, these Social Democrats, what they're doing, than anything that you see, even in the U.S. We're pretty pro-immigrant society, but that's partly we have a different history. Setting that aside, you're at a political impasse, and I feel like this would be a way where, you could get outside of that political impasse. Either that, or like you're just going to like leave the country anyway. The productive elements are going to leave the country anyway.
Yeah. I mean, I will say that it would be so strongly in America's interests for, say, President Trump to offer an immigration route for high-skilled Brits. Because at the moment, it's actually really quite hard to go over there. I don't actually want to go to America, because if we're going to immigrate, I'd go to Australia, because that's where my family are. But I have lots of friends and acquaintances who would go to America if they could get the visa.
Yeah, I mean, I have a fair number of friends actually who do remote work where, they live like princes in your country, relatively, because they have American salaries,
Yeah, to some extent, I have that because of most of my audience are American, and I write for American media outlets as well. I tell you what, American media outlets pay so much more than British ones.
That's what all the British people have told me, which is like, okay, like, yeah, that's sad. I mean, like they and like I said, there's no structural reason you have to like live this way. I mean, that's the thing that's like crazy. These are all these own goals. Like you guys speak, speaking English is it's like being born with a silver spoon in some ways, because you're automatically connected, if you want to be, to the most dynamic economy in the world. I mean, this is what people pay tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars for their kids in other parts of the world to learn. You guys are born speaking English. Not only that, like half of you are born speaking English that make you seem smarter to Americans. So that's an issue. Like every British academic talks about it, how people think that they're smarter than they are. It's just like a natural thing. So I don't see. I mean, this has been a very pessimistic conversation because you're in a pessimistic place. That's just like the fact. That's just the fact. But Britain, the UK, England does have structural advantages if they so decided to pivot. So this is a little bit like the Bay Area with its public disorder issues. If they wanted to like have a dictatorship of Michael Bloomberg, it will transform into a professional managerial class utopia overnight. This is a matter of will.
Yeah.
Right? It's a matter of will. It's a matter of like someone standing up and saying, look, we have all these advantages. We're not even connected to the European continent. Like you could do Australia's immigration policy. Like one of the reasons Australia could do it is it's an island, Yeah. You guys are an island. You guys could actually control your borders in a way that is much more difficult for Europe because people can get around, right? They can go through Russia or whatever. So you don't, your out of control immigration system is because you will it to be so. Ultimately, that is the fundamental truth. Like your nation is careening off the edge of a cliff because you're driving it off the edge of a cliff, but there is still time to swerve. There's still time to swerve. The issue is just like someone needs to just stand up and say, like, look, we're going off the edge of a cliff. This thing we have here is going to be over. We're just going to be like a fictional country that is an administrative reality, some sort of legal fiction. It's not a real country if we don't like figure this out. And a real country cannot be based just on like social welfare benefits of the NHS, which is all I hear about you guys. Honestly.
Yeah.
What else is there to your country? You know what I'm saying? There is a lot of, you guys have a deep history and all that stuff, but, on an individual level, people will talk about it. Like I have we're a PhD advisor, a British guy, and he goes back to Britain all the time. He's an American citizen now. He's married to an American, has an American kid, but he misses the pub culture. Yeah, we don't have that here. Okay, it's not. Maybe in a few parts of Boston, it's close, but not really. Like you guys have certain like unique things in your culture, in your society that do not exist in America. Okay, you're never going to get that, and if you value that, you got to fix what's happening. British people, English people have to fix their country because like that pub culture is not, that's depending on the history and cultural norms and all these other things, And so I don't know what to say because again, it's in your hands,
Yeah.
And so you voted for Labour. So you voted for the left-wing party to fix this. Okay, like, again, I don't get it, right?
I'm not voting for Labour, Razib.
You're not, but I'm just trying to say it's like you have, like this is not. Again, like there's not breaking out of the box. Like you're gonna run out of money. Like, which is why Thatcherism happened. Which is why Maggie Thatcher, because you guys in the 1970s, you were going off a cliff then. You were going off a cliff, and so maybe you need another Thatcher. Maybe that's just going to happen naturally. Like basically, a lot of times when countries approach fiscal insolvency, that's when they swerve. Like India did that in the early 1990s. Their balance of payments was out of whack, and they're basically like, we just need to like not be socialist anymore because we're not going to be around anymore. So I think that might be what does it.
Yeah, I mean, an kind of optimistic view that you'll hear from some people here is that this is just like the 1970s, and that therefore Thatcherism of a kind would solve it. I think it's different from the 1970s because of the mass migration factor, and because we're a really, really, really long way from remigration policies within the Overton window. I mean, even something like, like Reform, which are the most radical right party, they have like a single sentence in their manifesto about putting British people at the front of the queue for social housing. But absolutely no one is proposing that we like eradicate social housing in London, or that we no longer allow foreign nationals to live in social housing in the UK or anything like that. Like that's so far outside acceptable political discourse. I honestly think like it comes down actually to some very deep issues with like the Anglo-Celtic personality. I honestly think that the same personality factors and the same talents, I want to say, that allowed British people to turn a third of the world pink at one point in our history, right, are also now undermining us. So basically, my suspicion, and if anyone listening to this who wants to do some quantitative analysis, I'm sure it could be done, is that one way in which British people differ from other Europeans and certainly differ from other people in other parts of the world is we're probably very high in openness to experience, combined with being high IQ. And I think that kind of adventurousness, curiosity, like I compiled a list recently actually for an article of like the number of crucial inventions that were invented by people of British descent. It's enormous, right? I mean, just think about it. Like, I think something like all but one maybe of people who walked on the moon of British descent as well. Like there's a kind of unique set of traits which you see expressed in more extreme versions in some individuals of this like extraordinarily adventurous, risk-taking, entrepreneurial, yada yada. That's kind of during the 18th and 19th centuries that allowed Britain to dominate the world. Now I think that it is basically encouraging a kind of self-destructive bent when it comes to issues of race and immigration. The British people are just actually extraordinarily unracist, like compared with the French, right? Like,
no.
It's really not within the character, obviously with some exceptions. And so people they can. I mean, you talk to middle class people here about that. I think it's going to take so much for people to realize what is actually causing these problems. So much.
Yeah.
And I worry that by the time we get there, they're not solvable.
Yeah, I'll say like, my personal experience, like I haven't gone to Europe that much, but I've gone to Europe, and I will say like, just comparing it to the US, continental Europe, interpersonal racism is much, much greater. Like I've almost never experienced interpersonal racism in the United States. I did a fair amount in continental Europe. It tends to be more understated in Northern Europe than in Southern Europe, but it's still there. Britain is a lot more like the US. I will say though, this is in 2010, so this might have changed. I think it's actually changed for the worse. There's much more assumptions of segregation, kind of, like things that I saw where it was like, okay, like why would you just assume, like, yeah, there's just like things that I saw in the media or just talking to people where they would just assume that like people would be with their own kind, but that was the polite thing. Whereas in the US, I think that's more of like, that's what the woke revolution was trying to do. So and I've said this before, in my own lifetime in the US, I saw there was a period maybe between 1990 and like 2015, 2010, where people just stopped kind of talking about like race like it was super interesting. Like it was a thing, but like, interracial relationships, nothing was shocking. It wasn't commented on. And then like after 2015, it was like, oh, like, people have literally written about whether interracial relationships are okay because of power dynamic. Yeah, they use a different logic, but it's the same issue. So it came back. But there was a period there for 20 years in the US where I'm not going to say we were post-racial, but, like my personal life experience was way different from when I was little to now versus that in the middle, right? And in the UK, it's like, I would say because you guys are like I don't know, you're not like Canada, you're not explicitly multicultural in your ideology, I think, but operationally you just like live that way, and that's what I experienced, and I think that's a problem. And this is what we're talking about, like you use the word English, like the word English, Black English or whatever, like these words are not used, I think, and that is a problem. But the weird thing is if you look at the intermarriage rates for like Afro-British people, they're actually very high. And in the US, if someone is like an eighth, is a fourth Black, they're considered socially Black. Whereas in Britain, from what I can tell, it's not totally true. So you actually have like the opening within your cultural repertoire to assimilate in a way that we don't, but like culturally, you're so America brained, Yankee brained, as you would say, that you're not taking that opening, because the segregation problem you have is really with the South Asians, especially the Muslims, But with the black minority, it's actually not that big of a deal. I mean, I don't want to like, underemphasize it too much. There are some issues there, but I think like if you just look at the numbers, you guys would assimilate that minority very quickly. And but now you're making a big deal about the Black Foundation of England or the UK or whatever. I think that starts to change people's mentality, and like people who are a fourth Caribbean who would previously say that they were English with a Caribbean grandparent might start saying that they're Caribbean. Do you see what I'm saying? So it starts to change their mentality, and like you incent into being, this like kind of like oppositional culture. And so again, this is about the will that the English have. This because I know that like there's like supposedly some indomitable spirit, and the Blitz and all these things. Well, fundamentally, that's what you need. This isn't a matter of like complex financial engineering or anything like that, redoing your education system. It's just basically like, do you have the will to just coordinate and just accept who you were, and like not allow, because a lot of these things like kind of like fell into place piece by piece, and now you have like this like just massive cultural problems from all of these things, like the mass migration, NHS, payment transfers, etc. They're like a death by 1,000 cuts is what it sounds like. Like the housing, right? It's not like one thing. It's death by 1,000 cuts, Like you could actually have, if you guys had a point system, I'm not sure if like the numbers are sustainable even with a point system, because it's just like so great as a proportion of your population, your deaths. But obviously, Australia doesn't have the same problems that the UK has. Let's just put it that way. The US doesn't have the same problems that the UK have. So that can be reformed, right? The housing, we know how to build houses. This is a problem of all the Anglo countries where the older generations view housing as a way to get, unproductive wealth, because really they just sit on their houses and they just get richer and richer. This is magic, and so that's a cultural problem. All these are cultural problems. They can be fixed. So, as we're closing out, I just want to say, like, human spirit is capable of turning things around. I think like if we have enough people like Louise Perry leaving England, I think at some point people will be like, well, what's going on here? It's like people are voting with their feet, and we're losing our best and brightest. And we're losing the people that are making the money, that are paying into the fisc. At some point, reason has to kick in. It could be beyond. Sometimes things happen where there's just like there's a point of no return and there's a death spiral, right? So what we're looking at here is the British state. Is England going? Is it going to go on the death spiral, or is it going to swerve? Right. That's basically that's all that we're like confronting here, because it's right now it's death spiral, or like there's like massive changes. The election that just occurred as I'm posting this, it's still on the death spiral, because like Labour is just the uniparty, as you said. Like they don't really want to change anything, Yeah. And so there needs to be a massive change. So I think like what's going to happen is next 5 years, basically 2030. Like, I mean, you might not be there, but 2030 is like basically what you need to look at for, I think, the United Kingdom to figure out whether it wants to swerve away from it, because they need to elect a different party. Like Conservatives were wiped out. There needs to be either a new Conservative Party or a different party altogether on the right that takes into consideration the situation of the 21st century as opposed to the 19th century. I think fundamentally part of the problem with the Conservative Party is it's a very old party that has like these historical memories, and it's the party of the landed gentry and all that stuff. I know Thatcher tried to change it, but it's from what I've heard and seen, it seems like there's still kind of the complacent upper class aspect to a lot of the Tories, and so they aren't touched by a lot of these things. Or as rentiers, they benefit from them.
Yeah.
And so it's not, they're not. I mean, I know Britain's supposedly like a nation of shopkeepers, but you're losing your shopkeepers. Actually, that's the issue. They're coming here, from what I see. So.
Yeah, I mean, to end by being kind of perversely optimistic, actually, a funny kind of way, I kind of choose to think of, there are 200 million people of British descent in the world, only 50 million-ish of them live in the UK, right? Like, actually, if we, I can partly say this as British Australian, so I don't feel as strongly like my future is tied up with Britain per se, much as I love the old buildings and the hedgerows and the medieval churches, you know what I mean? Like, in the end, that stuff doesn't really matter. I think that if I have no doubts that British people are going to continue flourishing in one way or another, but they may not do it in the mother country.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. One interesting thing is that I was closing out. I think it would be interesting to do a social survey of people like you who in some way have a non-English connection, and then somebody who's so rooted in the country they don't even know. I mean, all English people have American relatives if you go far back enough. If you go 2 centuries, right? But there are probably English people who's like their whole families lived in Yorkshire forever, and they don't remember, or they have no connections overseas. I bet you those people will have a somewhat different mentality. And I think what you're talking about, the sorting, is actually a big deal. People have talked about this before. There's been books written about like basically how like the United Kingdom. Well, it wasn't the United Kingdom yet, but Great Britain in 1800 was demographically very different than 1900. And a lot of it had to do with mass migration because so many people left for other parts of the world. Like also like Ireland was much more the United Kingdom, whatever. Ireland was much more populous in 1800 relative to England. It was like a third of the archipelago's population, and then it was like 5% or something by 1900. So there was like a massive rebalancing. A lot of the Protestant dissidents left. The Protestant dissident elites left because they realized, okay, like this is, and so it's like England recreated itself by 1900. And I think what we're talking about here, there needs to be another recreation. So anyway, I'm going to close out here. We've been talking for a while. As I post this, you got the Labour Party in power, and they're probably not going to do anything different. So again, I'll put the links to all your podcasts and everything like that. And I hope the listeners enjoyed this conversation. We didn't talk about gender ideology or anything like that, which I like to do that sometimes with guests because there are people who are known for talking about one thing, but they have a lot of other opinions on other stuff. And I think that it's interesting to explore. And, I just have to say, the last couple of years, I have been thinking about Britain a lot because it's an important country. It's a big country. They're our sidekick, so it's like the health. I mean, that's just like, that's true. I'm sorry. It's just true, so it's like, when little brother's like sick or like ill, like you have to take be concerned about that. I know multiple people who thought about living in England, who thought about moving there, and then they moved back because they were just like, they like the lifestyle, but like they can't like afford to live there. And these are all professionals, like engineers, entrepreneurs, stuff like that. So I think that that's bad because the people who would want to go from America to Britain, there have always been people like that. They can't even do it anymore. The math just doesn't work unless they want to live in penury, So I think that's a really bad signal, and I hope we transform that, change that. I put my proposal out there. You guys can criticize it all you want, but give me something better. Like let's have a discussion about this because
I'm happy to be. We can become whatever state you like. At this point,
not vote, maybe a territory, whatever. I just don't want you voting in our national elections. You know why? All right, Louise, I'll let you go. And congratulations on the baby. And I mean, there's always positive things. There's always lights of positivity in the world, even if there's a lot of negativity around us. You're making a positive impact just by that in your own life and for other people. So I would say God bless you, but but take care, Louise.
Thanks, Razib. Bye-bye.
10% of pediatric cancer is linked to a single gene variation. These variants can be detected in embryos before pregnancy begins. Orchid's whole genome reports can help mitigate your child's risk for cancer by screening for 90-plus genetic variants linked to pediatric cancer. Discuss embryo screening and IVF with a genetics expert.
This podcast for kids